You know, we're very proud to have John here as faculty. He's a graduate of our program. He was the New England Regional Champion. He won the International Debate Academy in Slovenia. He was a semi-finalist at Nationals. He's just come to us from Beijing, where he was teaching. And he was also voted the #1 judge at U.S. Nationals last year. And I think you can probably tell it's not because he's cute, it's because he's smart. Give it up for John.
I'm just thinking of hiring him out for it. So that he can be like, dead children in Syria, John's great, peace. In the marketplace. Always in the marketplace.
This is such an awkward start to
Okay, so we're going to talk about second teams and how to be better at them. One thing in particular that we're going to talk about in this lecture is going to be really more some whip speaker stuff. I know some of you were in an exercise group that I did yesterday, well, that Mariella and I did yesterday, that kind of ended up talking a little bit about whip speeches. But basically, when you're on the back half, people will tell you a couple things. They'll say things like, well, you need to have this new argument in your extension speech, and that's good, you should do that. But that's not necessarily complete in the sense that you oftentimes don't just need to have like a new argument, you know, new analysis. These are things that you all probably know and are aware of, which is okay. But it doesn't hurt to go over them again and to really think about what that means. So many of you have actually, like, I've been asked by many of you at different times, things like, well, what happens like if you have a very solid first half team? Like, what do you do? What if they've come up with all the arguments that you wanted to talk about? How do you switch it up? How do you like really adapt to that situation? And the answer just is that you probably have to work and write frantically and hope and trust in yourself in a lot of ways and just say like, okay, we're going to stand up and we're going to do a good job. You're also going to probably rely a bit more on the whip speaker as well to really make sure that they're able to clarify anything that might have been messy, anything that might have been missing from the argument as well. So let's actually focus on that aspect of it and talk about like what's going on during the debate itself if you're on the back half. We have, that clock is completely wrong. Yeah.
I know 7.
Okay. Okay, so we have like, I'll probably talk for like 40 minutes? 35, 40 minutes, right around there. Ask questions interspersed throughout, and then at the end we'll in fact just only do questions, and that'll be fine. Okay, cool. Are there any questions to start? Sweet. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about whip speeches right now, because I think this is a pretty good area to really focus in on for this group of people. It's also a useful area because what ends up happening is that everyone focuses so hard on the extension. You just think about it, that's what you want to like talk about, and then the whip speech, you kind of stand up and you're just like, okay, well, we're going to give the speech and it'll be fine. That's not quite what you want to be doing. There's a lot of strategy that's going to go into the back half, particularly if you have a solid front half team. And because of that, you really need to be focused on what you need to do to actually win the debate. And this is where you're either like technically comparing arguments, or you're making sure that you have the most appropriate examples, or you're tricking the judge to think that you are the most important team in the round if you weren't actually. That's all the things that you do from the whip speech in particular. And so, ideally what you're doing most of the time throughout the debate is that you're simultaneously, like, you're flowing it, you're writing things down, but you're also judging the debate. You really want to be, like, if you're the whip speaker, I mean the extension speaker too should be thinking about these things, but you really want to be judging that debate in the most objective manner possible. You want to be thinking about what the judge is thinking, what are they writing down, what do they care about, why did they like that argument, you're maybe even going to look for their reactions and what, did they nod aggressively to that particular point that that team said. Those are the types of things that you really want to be cognizant of, because if you're not, then you don't have any idea what you need to say in the whip speech in order to convince the judge that you are in fact going to win the round. At that point, you're just making comparisons of arguments, and that's fine, like it's sufficient. No one's going to say that you've done a bad job, but if there's a better way that you can do the speech, then you ought to probably engage in that better form of it. So ideally what you're doing is you're going to serve as a bit of a judge for your team. You're going to be like really focusing in on what needs to happen. Oftentimes, your extension speaker might be frantically writing. They might be very concerned about what they're going to say. And because of that, they're listening to the round, but you're really flowing that round. You're taking the notes, you're very concerned about what's going on, and that's where you can be very helpful to your debate partner, to the extension speaker, as a whip speaker. in particular, because you can then point out some important arguments that need to be refuted, some things that have to be said in order for you to do better, in order to like actually do better than that team, that you would then focus in on in the whip speech itself. And this is where like there's a lot of communication that's going to go into it, but there's also quite a bit of teamwork in that if you tell the extension speaker something that you want them to say, maybe they want to like deploy an example or something like that. Yeah, and for, like a good example would be if you know something very specific about it that you didn't quite think of, and you just tell them like, talk about this a little bit. I know that you don't know about it, but I know a lot about it, and I'll say it in my whip speech, because you want it to originate in that member speech, and that's sufficient for it to sound very good, for it to sound as though it's not brand new in the whip speech. That's what you want to do. You want to have this like cohesive, speaking, example, great madness going on. And so the judge is just like, okay, yeah, look at that. They're consistent, they use similar language. And that's another interesting point here, because oftentimes, in the whip speech, you should use very similar language to what your member speaker used, particularly like in the way in which they have described their argument. This tends to be useful, because number one, it sounds like you're, in fact, now talking about the same stuff. But even if you're analyzing it now differently, they're not counting it as new, or they're not viewing it skeptically. They're more open to this type of material because it sounds like it's the same thing that was said before, even though they might be writing things that are slightly different. There's an additional burden of analysis that goes on in that speech, and that's very useful because it allows you to kind of sneak things in. Not like not brand new arguments or anything like that, but it certainly allows you to sneak in responses and things that have to be said. And then it's like, and then it's okay because it looks like you're just analyzing the extension more, even though which is what you're doing, but you're also adding a depth to it that perhaps was missing in the first place. Are there any questions about any of that stuff? Nothing really? Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so those are pretty much what I tend to consider two of the more important whip speaking strategies that end up being glazed over, not really talked about that much. Definitely serving as like that judge is very important because it allows you to know what's going on in the debate, where the debate is going, and what is in fact going to be important in the debate round, or for the judge to make the decision. And so oftentimes you should be able to leave the round and have a pretty good idea about like what the ranking is going to be and why. So that strategy, like that's one strategy right there. And the second one, of course, is like that helping out your partner aspect of this, where like you identify key pieces of refutation that need to be said. You identify key arguments that maybe they weren't flowing as closely, or maybe they didn't realize that there wasn't as good of a response as there could have been. And so you can then say, this response wasn't good enough. This is key to their case. You need to make a response now, so that we can actually be engaging with like this key concept, this key argument that they make from first opposition or first government or whatever team, whatever first half team. So those two are like useful strategies that you can really use and think a bit about while you're on the second half. As far as ways in which you can now try and differentiate yourself a bit more from first half into second half, the idea here really is that you want this to again happen in both speeches. And that's what's key here. Like most of the time there's a disconnect, especially like at a more beginner level, between what the extension speaker is saying and what the whip speaker is going to stand up and say, because it's a little bit confusing, it's a little bit weird. All of those things happen. So, ideally, the extension speaker is going to kind of stand up, and they're going to give you a couple reasons to think that this is new, this is interesting, this is great. And that's what you should do. You do want to make that distinction very clear. You want to explain why things are more important as they come out of your speech and as you're doing it. Now, it's difficult to do that for every single claim that you make, for every single impact. It's, in fact, probably impossible to do that. Which then means that another burden is going to fall upon the whip speaker to then make those comparisons and explain what the new argument was, why it was important, and then how it functioned within the debate. This is all stuff that, like, you probably know, but actually figuring out how to do is very difficult. In that, I can't tell you how to write this down, or like what to do if you're going to write it down, and like what it looks like on a sheet of paper, because it probably looks no different than any other notes that you would take. Like not really. There's no special way of taking notes that then just are magically going to mean that you know how to compare everything in a debate round. Which means that you just need to be much more cognizant of it if you're going to like try and implement these types of strategies. Be much more aware of what's happening in the debate round is going to be somewhat useful to you. In addition, it's going to mean that you'll then have a much better understanding of what's going on in the debate, where the debate is going, and why it's going in that direction. Any questions about any of that you are concerned about or would like to talk about? No questions about the back half at all? Seriously? None? I'm skeptical if this is true.
Actually, I do.
Okay.
When should the partners talk to each other during the rounds? Because sometimes if you talk, you can't hear the other person speaking.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good question as well. And that's where sometimes it's more useful to write things down very quickly in big letters. I mean, I always write big because I have such horrifying handwriting. So the only way that anybody can read it is if it's this big on a sheet of paper. But yeah, so I mean, you just talk during speeches that aren't that important to you, which sounds awful, but you just quickly lean over and yeah, say this thing. This is important, and then point to your notes and whatever. Make sure that the message gets conveyed, because the worst thing that could happen would be if you had a ridiculous miscommunication. They thought that you were saying something, then they get up there and they start speaking, and they're like, yeah, I got this, and then they say something completely different than what you wanted them to say. That's a bad situation. Try to avoid that. I think that answers the question. That seems good. What's up, Becca?
Oh, that was my exact question.
Oh, was it?
Like,
When you
yeah,
talk
when
to your
do you
partner?
communicate with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that... So there are always times during speeches that are not important. The introduction is not important. The in-between part of the speech, between one speech and another speech, is not important. That's fine. You can talk during those times. Even when you know what the argument is, but they're just being very flowery with their language, and you're just okay, well they're going to say these things right now. I know what the argument is. I know what the impact is. So then you can just kind of chat with your partner a little bit. The key thing here is just to make sure that you're quiet when you're doing it, because otherwise you're going to be interrupting the debate round. That would be problematic because you don't want the judge to be shut up, stop talking, because then you're that's negative attention. You just don't want negative attention within the debate round. Anything else before we move on to something slightly different? Yeah.
You can choose not to answer this if you think it's a distraction, but I've been unscientifically observing the way that people take notes in debates, both competitors and judges, and found absolutely zero overlap or consistency in any of the debates I've been in. Is there a recommended strategy or some sort of advantageous way in which you take notes in a debate that would help us see these comparisons?
So the answer is probably no. There isn't really. One thing. You got something?
Just make sure they're legible.
Yeah, so
Well, no, and I say that, and then...
No, it's true. So for example, my notes are usually, when I was speaking in particular, my notes were usually illegible, which meant that I'd have to look down and not be sure what I was saying. I'd look down and be is that a word? It's unclear. And so that was always problematic. And so eventually, as far as speaking goes, as far as writing down a speech, I found that blank paper and writing large is useful, because it means that you can glance down and know what you're going to say very quickly and easily. You're not reading necessarily, you're not trying to spend mental energy reading while you're up here speaking, which is a good thing. But as far as the note-taking and flowing the debate itself, that one's a little bit different. I'm not going to say everyone, but there are lots of different strategies with regards to how you best make comparisons in a debate. I know lots of people who will take a sheet of paper, this isn't blank, but they'll write the Prime Minister's speech, they'll write the Leader of Opposition speech, and then they won't write on the back of these pages. They'll then take another sheet of paper so that they can look all the way across, and so that they can make those comparisons like that. So then this next sheet of paper here would then have the Deputy Prime Minister's speech, which would then be the responses to the Leader of Opposition. And so that's one way of doing it. I mean, the way I just take notes pretty much on one sheet of paper, front and back, just because while I'm judging, it's fine. I mean, it's a little bit different in actual tournament rounds, just because that's slightly more important than a practice debate with regards to figuring out an actual ranking. And so, yeah, it tends to just be a style that is useful for you. I've just always hated writing on line paper. That is the only thing. It's the only thing that I'm concerned about. Lines on the paper. It's the worst. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a few different strategies that I've seen, I guess, more consistently is people will take a page like this and put it in 4, and then have the 4 speeches, and then on the back have the other 4 speeches. Or people will cut the page in half and then do 4 columns, So then you have all 4 speeches on one page. What I do is I write a line down the middle and I say like them, us, and then I draw my responses across like that. So, like, you know, you want to, instead of, because I know like people will write, I know some, when people start debating, they write chronologically, just like in like order of the lines on the page, instead of like splitting them up to be able to see what's happening. So it's really difficult to compare a prime minister's speech to a member of government speech if they're like listed, like written like a novel is, you know? You have to like flip back.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, especially. There are probably some things that you just ought not do with regards to flowing debates. Like, for example, I can imagine not writing anything down is for an example. Like, you should write things down is step one. Otherwise, after that, you just want to make sure that you are able to see speeches kind of looking at one page and be able to like identify those speeches are there and what they were, what was important in them. Usually, I will say this much though, usually if I was giving whip speeches, I would be circling things and be much more engaged in the debate than I am as a judge, because as a judge I don't want to be making those comparisons for the speakers. But like as a whip speaker, I do want to be making the comparisons. I want to say, here, this is the one that I want to talk about. And so I'll like draw a line between like 2 arguments, which is fine because then later on in the debate I'm able to remember and look back at my notes, because that's where I'm going to be taking my whip speech from, basically. So that's actually perhaps a useful piece of information to think about, in that your whip speech is really coming from your flow, from the debate notes that you've now taken. And oftentimes, looking back is going to waste a lot of time. By looking back, you're going to be trying to rethink about the speech that was said. You're going to rethink the arguments. You're going to wonder if your notes were in fact consistent and coherent, and were they good? Did you miss anything? All of that is going to be important. So during the debate itself, starting to really like circle, figure out what arguments are interacting, what needs a response, and however you go about doing that is fine. Like maybe you have a red pen that you leave on the side of your desk and you write something over an argument or next to an argument that says like need response or something like that.
I'm a big fan of the clicky pen.
Yeah, clicky pen is key.
Yeah,
Whole
so like
bunch of
the
different colors.
multicolored pen,
Oh.
because then you can just keep your speech and responses separate from your opening halves
Yeah.
responses.
Color-coded wise, yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
like, I'll
So
have a
green could be opening government with refutation, and then whatever then you say as
Yeah.
well. Yeah,
and then,
that's very smart.
then red is for my jokes.
Jokes are in fact the most important part of being on the second half, believe it or not. That's the way that you win almost every time, is by being the funniest. No, but it's actually true. So,
In
Yeah, I still have no idea.
in our rounds it's certainly true. There's not even a question of that. What was that? Third?
I'm completely lost on whether you're kidding or not.
I'm mostly kidding.
Okay.
Yeah, your argument should be much better.
You have very convincing sarcasm.
I'm not kidding.
Monica is not kidding. I am definitely
But we
kidding.
come from different schools
Yeah.
of whip speech.
You come from Canada.
And you think I'm slowing?
This devolved quickly. So,
That's right, I made it funny.
yeah. And this is why there are differences in opinions about whip speeches. So, are there any other questions before we kind of move into a slightly different and probably more boring topic of like points of information from the back half? Because we can talk about that. Yeah.
If a round throughout the entirety of the non-whip speeches is extraordinarily messy, to the point where,
Incoherent even.
yeah, almost
Yeah.
incoherent.
I can imagine a run like
Like,
that. I've seen a run like
yeah,
that.
you just have to be my round.
I didn't want to say it, but okay.
Yeah, fair. What do you think is the way the whip speaker should approach being comparative about arguments that aren't comparative?
At that point, I honestly just think that the whip speaker is just being a rhetorical tool in the debate. In that, if the debate is actually that messy, in which this case it was that messy, you are just, like, you stand up and you just recognize and accept that the debate is messy. You're like, well, that was completely messed up. Everything that happened before me, that was rough. Like, you make that type of recognition, because when you do, in fact, recognize it, the judge is probably going to be like, yeah, let's see, what are you going to do now to make this not as messy? And that's where, like, so in a particular situation, like, a messy debate is often one in which teams speak in parallel lines. The government says one thing, the opposition says another, and there's just no mixing at all. They don't do anything to really compare against each other. They don't do anything to even explain to you why one argument is more important than another. maybe their arguments are even bad and they're just like saying ridiculous things, which is also a very strong possibility. And so at that point, right, it's not as though the burden is now on you to recreate 48 minutes of the past and make it better. That's not what you're attempting to do. What you are attempting to do is to put a good and decent 7-minute spin on what did happen, on why your team was very important, maybe why your member speaker was very comparative and how they did wonderful, beautiful things against the other arguments. That's all good stuff to do. And if they didn't do that, which is also likely, it's possible, then you do it. You compare it and be like, listen, I'm going to tell you about this argument that my extension speaker made, and I'm going to tell you why it beats these 4 arguments from opposition, or vice versa, whatever. And that's fine, that's totally good to do. It's just not, the burden on you at that point is not to then be this comparative heavyweight that explains why the debate was so much better than the judge actually thought. You can just be like, listen, it was bad, here's what's going to happen now. And that's fine.
If the round is that bad, honestly, like the only thing you have to do as a whip speaker is to try and convince the judges not to commit mutual murder-suicide pact that they've been planning for the past 20 minutes.
That's probably fair. This is an instance where jokes in fact do win.
Yeah,
But-
yeah. In fact, and there are like certain buzzwords you can open your whip speech with, which is being like, I think we've had a very interesting debate today. I think we should take a step back
Yeah.
and analyze the arguments as they went through the round.
Yeah.
And show you why we don't make you want to kill yourself.
Ultimately, yeah. Additionally, things like saying things along the lines of clarifying, like you want to use that word quite a bit, like let me clarify this area of the debate for you. That's fine, because it's ultimately what you're doing anyways, but in particular in a messy round, like, it'll happen. And another good thing to take note of is that very good debaters are not necessarily, like, immune to having horrifyingly bad debates, where they just don't actually communicate, where they are just, for whatever reason, aren't comparative. So it's also very likely that you could be in a good round, where you're just like, finally a good round, like here we go. But it can also just, in fact, be very awful. And that burden is going to be somewhat easier, because it's likely that good arguments were made, at least like, maybe, right? It's more likely that good arguments are going to be made. And because the analysis is like decent, you then actually have the ability to come in and actually do the comparative work. Additionally, this is a good instance where whip speech is easier in most cases. Because if nobody else before you did any comparative analysis between arguments, and therefore it's messy, therefore they're talking in parallel lines, that means that you just have the final say. You just get to say to everybody, like, listen, this is the comparison, obviously this is more important. Nobody else told you before me, here's why this is going to happen, like, here's why this is the final word on this. And so that's something that people don't usually look at that as an opportunity to convince the judge, to like tell the judge why they won. They're nervous about the fact that it was a messy debate. They're freaking out about the fact that they're like, I don't know what to do. Like, this is not a normal whip speech. And that's fine. That's totally acceptable. And it's okay. You just then need to go ahead and do the work, do what you would almost normally do, but recognize that you're doing a lot of work that should have been done earlier in the debate round.
This is more for the extension speaker. Like, say you're closing Gov, and opening Gov doesn't really do a good job of like giving clear distinctions of like what their world looks like underneath the, like their model is kind of not even maybe there.
Missing parts.
Yeah, can you stand up and like give an alternative model, or not like it's different, but, like give more structure to the round in the extension speech, or like, or is that like complete knifing, or like I don't know if that's the phrase.
The reason that you can't do that explicitly in the way that you just described it is because you then render first opposition obsolete for the debate round, and that's unfair because they argued against what first proposition said, and then but if you just completely change it based on the mechanistic problem that you had with the model, then everything that happened before you is now like moot, and that's unfair.
Mm-hmm.
So what you can do is like there are sneaky ways that you can go about making a first government team maybe look not as awful as what they did. So one good example is to say things like, let's say they didn't have a very clear model, or they were just, like whatever, they just didn't do it. It was like this house would, God, what would it be, something like let's say it was this house would invade Syria, and they were just like, yeah, we'll invade Syria, here are 3 arguments why. And they don't tell you how they're going to do it, they don't tell you why, like nothing, all of that's missing. So they're going to lose this debate, very clearly from the start. Because they don't give you any information about a model or whatever, who's going to even invade Syria. None of that. From second government, you can be like, listen, here are previous scenarios in which military intervention has been used in certain countries, and here's how we went about it. Usually it's this like UN sanctioned deal where there's a coalition of people. All of that's acceptable to do, just be like, these are likely ways in which we imagine a military invasion of Syria happening. Not that they necessarily are the ways that they would happen, but there are some ways to do it, and that provides clarity to the round. The judge will be happy, and then you can just go ahead and make your extension, which is totally okay. You're also just like, the only times in which you're really constrained and burdened by a model is when it's just so bad. Not that it's missing anything, but when it's like oddly specific, and therefore makes it impossible for you to do anything in the round. And so like, it's bad in the sense that it's specific and not quite correct. That's the case where you're just like, well, there's nothing to be done. And because I mean, honestly, most of the time there just isn't. There just isn't anything to be done in those situations where like they're very clear about their model. They're just also completely incorrect about it. Anything else? Any other questions? So, we're talking a bit about POIs and stuff like that from the second half, because honestly, this is an undervalued thing, but it's very important. Well, I think it's very important at least, and so, because you have to listen to me, we're going to talk about it. When you're on the second half, there are teams that you don't get to, well, really, so there, anywhere in the debate, there are teams that you don't get to directly engage with. If you're on the first half, for example, you don't necessarily get to directly respond to anything that, say, the opposite second team says. Because you don't really have that opportunity. You know, the opportunity that you have is, of course, in a point of information. And the same is true, when you're on the back half. Like, obviously it's fine because you get to speak afterwards, but you really, like, want to give the first half teams a chance to respond to your speech. In fact, it's almost more important to accept points of information from the first half teams, I would imagine, at least strategically, than taking them from the back half, your opposite back half. Now, part of this as well, though, and I know that most of you, well, people that I know, I can recognize that you've probably been in outrounds before, and a very good example of this is when, like, if you're looking to get the first or the second, or something like that, there are often situations where you're strategically thinking about who the strongest other team in the round is. And so that's who you want to engage with. So if you're second government, and you think that first opposition had probably the strongest arguments in comparison to yours, like you think that the one and the two is going to be decided between first opposition and second government, then you know what? You want to give first opposition a strong chance to really engage with your extension and to prove why you're a stronger team or your arguments were stronger than anything that they had said. And the way that you're best able to do that, to provide that, time for engagement, is actually by accepting their points of information and really discussing them in depth. Now, that doesn't mean that you should exclude other teams necessarily, but it does mean that sometimes you might want to preference taking one team over another, because you know what, if you're a second government and you want to talk about first opposition, you have all the time in the world to discuss second opposition. You're going to directly refute them. They're going to be speaking after and before you. That's all totally acceptable to do. And it's probably a more useful use of your strategic time within the debate itself. Because that will actually provide a level of engagement that you could have maybe not accessed beforehand. Anything on that you'd like to discuss or begin? Yeah.
I have a question generally about points of information. And this is when you are in the closing, and then you raise a point of information to the opening house, or opening whatever opponent, and you say a really important point that ends up being stolen by your opening. And there goes all your extension. So how do you do that?
So, the answer is that you don't. So there's a term for it. It's called flagging your extension. There's nothing to suggest that the first half team, like let's say you're second government again, you're the member speaking, you're like, I'm really excited about this extension that I have going on here. And so you ask the leader of opposition this point of information that very clearly indicates what your argument is going to be. A very smart first government team will sit there and be like, all right, that's mine now, and I'm going to talk about it. And the reason why is because it will then make it much more difficult for you to give a good extension, which means that strategically they're more likely to win lots of good things. In fact, that's what they should be doing, because each team in the round should be trying to win without cheating. And that's not cheating, because you've now entered into, you've given the idea. It's now an open source idea. So, don't flag your extension. Or, be tricky and flag an incorrect extension. Give a point of information that you're just like, well, what about this very important thing that I'm going to talk about? And then the deputy prime minister's like, okay, I'm going to talk about that now. And then you're just like, here's this other thing that I'm going to really impact. But seriously, you all laugh. This is a very good, it's a very useful strategy. There are many times where, like, especially if you're perceived to have the smartest idea, or like it's likely that you would have the smartest idea in the room, they will buy it. They will absolutely be like, okay, ooh, that was close. We didn't have a good deputy speech coming, but now we do. So this is, seriously though, I don't know why you're all laughing. This is very important. No, it's okay. So the idea behind it is that you don't want to give away your argument. It's the absolute last thing that you want to do. Like, you really want to be protective of it. There are often, so an example of this is that there are often many teams who, when they're sitting in order, like, if it's, first government, second government, the second government team will have the whip speaker sit next to the deputy speaker. Because they don't want the deputy speaker to look over and see what the argument is and steal it. And so they will switch seats like that to make sure that that does not happen. That's kind of the idea here. You want to do basically the same thing about, like, switching seats with regards to the points of information that you're giving. You don't want to give it away. You don't want to make it sound like you have this excellent idea, unless it's to the point where it's now too late for them to actually compare it. So maybe at, like, the 5.5 minute mark, if you're lucky enough to get a POI to the leader of opposition at that point, like, then maybe that's fine, because there's no way that they're going to take a minute and a half and actually do your argument in any better way. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I often think of trying to do like reactive POIs when you're on the back half. So if front half says something that's like ridiculous, like it's because that way, if you're giving a POI that's like your argument is wrong, like in a reputation kind of POI, then you're not giving away your argument, but you are interacting with the front half team.
Yeah, I think that's okay. I think it's probably fine to do it, like, because ultimately you want any type of engagement. But I would still think that not just a refutation type of point, but something that's maybe more like stronger and actually pointing things out that are problematic, or making comparisons that the first government team that should be responding to them aren't making. Things along those lines are probably going to be a stronger type of point, just because just reacting isn't going to, like, hold any weight towards the end of the debate. Which is okay, but, well, no, sorry, that's not okay. It's not okay for that to happen. Yeah.
Like, in a situation like the one that Arwa just described, the judge would give credit to the person that actually makes the argument. Like, the judge wouldn't give credit to the person who asked the POI. You know what I mean? Because that's where it first appeared.
I mean, sure, that's where it first appeared, but all the work was done by the person who makes the argument.
Okay.
And so because of that, yeah, like, it'll, like, oh, that was a good POI. Too bad they took your argument and, did beautiful things with it.
Okay.
And then, like, if you get up and then you try to do the same thing and you don't do it as well, then yeah, you will lose that particular battle. Which actually brings up an interesting point. Like, there are times where origination of material matters quite a bit, and there are other times where it doesn't really. Points of information doesn't really matter. Like, it's not, unless it's a good situation where, like, you flag your extension, you ask the POI, you get them to kind of, like, respond to a theoretical version of your argument in a way that doesn't give it away, and so you're then able to stand up as the member of government and say things like, well, that POI that I asked is very important because here's the extension that we're going to bring. And, like, there are times where that level, that, like, layering of consistency is important, but oftentimes it's just not going to win or lose a round for you, is really the ultimate point. Like, that's what you should be more concerned about, strategically speaking. Things that will win or lose you a round, that's what you should be focusing on first and foremost, rather than some more minor things like, whether or not a POI was the origination of something. A good example of when something is important where it originates is when material that originates in the member's speech that is then repeated and made stronger in the whip speech. That's the type of consistency, like a team consistency you definitely want to strive for. That's good. With repeating but with adding. That's the idea. No? Nothing else? You're all good?
Sorry, so
yeah.
What did you say was the strongest POI for the back half was?
I mean, any POI that... The premise of this question is not, like, actually correct. There's not probably a strongest, in fact I feel like I'm now answering a POI, but there's probably no strongest version of a POI. Like, there are probably weak versions of POIs, things that are just like, not really questions, like yes or no questions, like, do you actually think this? Yes, moving on. Like, that's probably not going to do you any good. So forcing them to respond to something, or to compare their argument against something else, things that get them talking for a while, and get them off track, like those are always going to be your strongest ones. if there's an instance where you look down at your argument and you're like, there's a way that I can ask a point of information about this argument without giving it away, and I understand this is like now very nebulous, but that's the idea. Like, if you can not ask the POI without giving the argument away, then maybe you should ask that POI. Because it's fine, you can get them to respond to it. Or maybe the debate isn't going in the direction that you wanted it to go. And so you really need to get them to like do something good or do something important. This is not exactly an advanced strategy, but if your first government team is horrible, or like they just do something incorrect, oftentimes it's great for you to just stand up from second government and blame first opposition in a POI for it. So something like, let's say they don't have a clear model, you can ask the leader of opposition and be like, why do you not understand this model? Like, and force them to try and explain it better, so that way as the second government team, you're not stuck with a really awful thing that you have to defend. Like, that's the type of strategy that is useful from the second half teams, where you're trying to influence and force the debate into a more beneficial set of arguments for you to actually then discuss your argument. So let's say it sounds like they're about to talk about something that would be very important to your argument, like from the first opposition, for whatever reason, again, your second government, first opposition. Distract them with something else. Like, get them off the topic of what you, like, maybe you wanted to really discuss in depth, like the way that, like, impoverished babies dying, like that was your extension. Tuna came in, like, chemical weapons in Syria, like, I'm feeling sad. So dying babies is your extension. And there, first opposition is about to talk about, like, why we should value things other than, like, dying babies, whatever. Like, human life is not that important in this situation. You want to stand up and you want to distract them. You want to get them away from that point so that they don't end up making that argument. So then you ask a POI that will strategically force them into a different area of the debate. This is, like, these are the types of interactions that you want to, again, be, like, thinking and focusing on to make sure that your arguments then look stronger than they might have otherwise been. Yeah.
So, we were in a debate once where the first op team basically misheard the resolution and thought the debate was something else, just literally based on like a poorly done info slide.
That's surprising.
Yeah, and they asked a POI particularly about that, and of course everyone in the room was like, what's going on? What's like an effective POI to be like, isn't that wrong what first op said, but not the debate, and we're not going to talk about it? Without like
from the second half?
Yeah, because you're if like they.
Do you mean first government misunderstood it, or?
Yeah, or like first opposition misunderstood it, and then first gov like agreed with them that was the correct thing. Oh. So like, and so how do you like? Because if you're second op, you can't be like, well, let's ignore the top half.
I'm not gonna, so
You pick up earlier, you pick up harder, so you don't end up in those rooms.
I mean, I did want to strategically do that from first opposition because the first government was like doing ridiculous things. And I was like, no, you need to talk about other things.
I had first government once when we were on second opposition stand up and say we should intervene. The United States Congress should force Turkey to apologize for the current genocide of Armenians that are going on within their border. And we were all like, no. But the obvious, there is no genocide of Armenians.
You had the weird apology things in that as well.
Well, I got from a POI and I was like, we thought this was a resolution. Are you sure you don't want to take a moment? We'll stop the time so you can confer with your partner. And the judge is going,
Well, so
But you can.
another example of that is like, first government was
okay.
So we had a debate about like Israel-Palestine, like Israel and whatever, and it was listen, it's important because first government, we were second government, and first government stood up and was like, Israel and Pakistan have been at war. So, to make sure that we weren't behind that first government, I stood up for POI, the leader of opposition, who agreed that Pakistan was Israel's biggest enemy. It was like, don't you mean Palestine? Like, can we talk about this for maybe a couple minutes? And then they were just like, oh yeah, that is what we mean. And so we just blamed them. We were like, first opposition, why did you mess up so badly? And then first government was like, the panicked look on their face was like, oh shit. We did not mean Pakistan. Ultimately, I think the answer to your question, Becca, is that you just have to kind of be an asshole.
yeah.
And be like, listen, like, first opposition, you think the debate is about this, when the motion seems to indicate that it might be worded in like this House believes that, and then repeat it. Like that would be okay. Be like, I have a copy. Like,
I think that's also like if you get in a situation where they've mixed up a proper noun, like an actual actor, like the Pakistan Palestine one, which is amazing. You can be like, but wouldn't you agree that Palestine has better things to spend their money on a Palestinian space program?
I actually had a round where opening gov confused Pakistan and Palestine, but the leader of op was from Pakistan, and she was like,
were we in this round together? Because that was true as well in mine.
Maybe she was closing off.
Hopefully there wasn't more than one person.
Maybe you guys were just at the worst tournament ever.
It was USU 2010, so.
So it's scary. Do you think that this happens a lot? The Palestine-Pakistan one?
It doesn't really. It doesn't happen often.
Oh no, just like different situations are coming up.
Yeah, it's weird. So that's weird that happened twice there. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, if the first half of the debate is not going even close to the way that you expected it to go from the second half, then you need to do your best to try and change it. And one of the ways that you try to change it is that you just totally, you just totally blame the first half opposite team through POIs, and you make it sound like they're in fact the most horrible team in the round, because you can't say it about your first government team, or you can't say it about your first opposition team. And then you can just, by doing that, you can influence and change it. And you have to just remember that the judge, in all likelihood, is going to really want to not sit through the worst debate they could possibly imagine. It's grating to write down things that just aren't important over and over and over again and say, oh, well, good, you refuted this unimportant argument that nobody cared about in the first place. That's horrifying for a judge to do. It's like, and you know it right when the Prime Minister stands up and they say something, you're just like, oh no, what did you do? Why did you think that? And that's a bad tenor to set from the very start. So if you're the second government team, or you're the second opposition team in either situation, so you're probably thinking in your mind right now from the start, you're like, all right, back half. That's what we're going to try to do. This is going to be a back half debate. We'll make sure that it's back half. And you just want to seem like the most reasonable person in the round. Stand up and you be like, well, listen, here's this thing that we would like to talk about. Would you like to? And that's even a situation where you want to just give them an argument. Give them something to talk about so that's not the worst possible debate that you could ever have. Because that's okay. Then you just look generous, and the judge is like, okay, they're going to win.
And then that's when you get to do my favorite kind of speech, which is, they could have said this, they could have said this. Did they say any of those things? No. They said stupid things.
Yeah, that is in fact the most fun with speech, because you do in fact get to stand up and say, well, here was this nice argument that could have been made. I don't have it written down anywhere, but I wish I did. I wish I could talk more about this, but they just ignored this. Instead they told you about dying babies. And that's kind of the level that we're at right now. What other second half questions do you have? We have approximately 15 minutes. That clock is completely incorrect, so we can keep chatting. It's all good. I've given you the lecture information that I have.
It's like the standard question where if your opening half dominates basically every main point, and you just can't think of anything amazingly new, how much do you have to add to not get screwed?
Enough that you get second place.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So the idea there is that if you have a very good first government team, like a very good first government team, they're solid across the board. You're just like, okay, they were great, they were excellent. Nobody else in this room is probably going to beat them. Then the first thing in your mind should be, we could probably get second place though, and what second place would look like in that debate is a government bench. So if it's a government bench that you need to convince the judge of, then you're going to explain why every government argument beats every opposition argument. Because you want to make it clear that there's nothing that opposition had done in this debate to make it sound as though they had any traction to oppose the policy that the government bench had in fact described. This is where that judging thing really becomes very important. Because you're also going to be viewing the round in a way that will probably be most helpful to you. There are different things that you say if you want to make the debate sound like it's a government bench, from either the extension or the whip speaker. There are things that you could say to make it sound as though that's the most convincing adjudication decision. There are also things, though, if you wanted to make it a back half, that you then explain in order to make it sound like it's a back half. The ideal position that you want to be in is that you want to have dominated the round sufficiently from the member's speech that you've won. You are the victor in this round. That's great. That's excellent. Then in the whip speech, you want to be able to tell the judge, we won, but here's who second place was. That is the ideal situation where you're just like, this is going to be a back half debate. I'm going to tell you why this was a back half debate. A second opposition, they'll get second place, and then whatever for the first half, doesn't matter. That's really the ideal situation where you want to convince, like, everyone knows that you won, but you want to then make the convincing argument about who is also, and like, the reason this is important is because in out rounds, that means that you would then have a bit of ability to try and convince the judge about what team will go through with you into the next set. So like quarterfinals, 2 teams are going to go through to the semifinals. Do you want it to be the best, like the second best team in the round? Absolutely not. You want it to be probably the worst team that was in your debate. Because then it makes it more likely that you will then continue on in the tournament. Because you want to win. That is the idea here. You would like to be victorious.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I hope that was in fact helpful.
That
Yeah.
realpolitik approach.
How are you subtle about this so that if you're wrong, you're not just like the asshole who's losing the round who comes up in this whip speech and is like, well, we clearly are like this, and so these people are this. Like, how do you...
Well, because ultimately your goal is to be convincing.
Yeah.
And so, like, it's acceptable that as long as you're not being like... So I said this, in fact I said this yesterday, and it's worth saying again. You should never stand up in a whip speech and actually give a ranking. That's not what you should do. You should learn first, then there's 2, there's 3, the 4, like whatever, that's it. Like, that is not the idea. But the reason why that's not the idea is because, number one, it's not that convincing, it's not that subtle, it's not that persuasive in any real way. Ideally, you're giving the judge not a decision per se, but a way of viewing the debate round, a way of understanding the round in the context of the arguments that were made. Because oftentimes, though very good debates will in fact have like arguments that are being thrown up against each other, there will be clash, there will be lots of things that everyone talks about as being good in the debate round. It won't be everything. And there still won't necessarily be a decision that's easily and readily made until after the whip speeches. Is that if you have a good whip speech, it should be a convincing reason why you've won and why that framework that you've provided for the debate round is the most convincing way for the judge to make the decision that they want to make. So if I'm as a judge evaluating the debate in a way that, like you're telling me as a government or op whip, you're telling me these are the important issues that you should be focused on when you're making your decision. Like you should be considering whether or not freedom is as important as like security or something, like those types of things, because that's very broad. But like that's ultimately the idea there, that if you're going to tell me what's important in the round and what, like the way that I should view it, then it's likely that you're not going to come off as like this person who like just doesn't know they got the 4 yet. But like it happens, it does happen, but you still have to stand up and try and do your best to convince. Like if your first half teams are just excellent, they're clearly the 1 and the 2, and you know like you're probably going to get the 3 or the 4. That doesn't mean that you like don't have any obligation to try and convince the judge that you're still got first place. That's your role. That's what you should be doing.
Okay.
Yeah, because you're still, again, you're trying to win. Maybe you will in fact trick them. It's very possible. It happens more often than you would think. Judges are just like, oh yeah, I loved this thing that you said. And it's like, okay, well, you're wrong, but thank you, we won. But seriously, it does in fact happen. Not all the good judges that are here. Monica, good judge, right there. Never tricked. She'll have excellent feedback for all of you as well. Very kind, in fact. Very kind feedback as well.
I should mention Patricia was one of my baby novices. Did I give kind feedback, Patricia?
Oh, so sweet.
What are your other questions about the second half? Anything, any lingering questions, anything that you're concerned about in particular with regards to maybe structuring things or strategic questions? The good thing about the second half especially is that from the very beginning, the way that you're taught to do the second half is also your ultimate best strategy to win, which isn't true about the first half, in that if I just say, well, first proposition, just set up that debate. That's not your best winning strategy, just to set up the debate. That is not sufficient for you to win. But if you add an excellent extension, that is always going to be sufficient for you to win if you've done it well enough. But no matter how well you set up a debate, other teams can beat you because they've made better arguments. And so that's the one good thing about the back half, in that, or at least in the way that in America we teach it, you just end up, maybe Canada too, who knows, you just end up also being taught from the very start how to win from the back half. which means that all of you kind of already have the implicit ideas about what would be the best way to approach a second half, like from the second half, what their best approach is going to be. So at this point, it's much more a matter of adding those types of smaller strategies about influencing the debate before it's actually happened, recognizing the arguments that are going to be made, how they're going to, in fact, play against each other, and how that will affect the extension. And knowing that early enough in the debate round, and being able to identify it for your partner so that they can, or like either way, so that you know what your strategy is going to be, what you can influence, what you can't influence. That's going to ultimately be the important thing that you can do from the back half. If there are no other questions, we'll take a bit of a break, because we have about 6 minutes. So, nothing else? Great, cool. Thank you, everybody. Good. Good audience.
I don't know.
No.